So please join me in welcoming Minister Radoslaw Sikorski to the Chicago Council.
Thank you for the introduction. My mother would really appreciate that. And thank you all for coming on a Sunday morning. Shouldn't you all be at the golf course or at church? But I'm really glad you came to hear me, because it's always a pleasure to be back here in Chicago, a city that thinks big, looks outwards, and loves to innovate. As I was preparing for my speech, I learned that back in 1893, Chicago hosted a huge world fair to commemorate the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the New World 400 years earlier. And George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. rose to the occasion. He built the world's first tall revolving wheel, allowing people to rise high in the air and enjoy the sights. Ferris wheels were named after him, and the world's largest wheel, fully twice the height of that first remarkable one in Chicago, is now in Singapore. Now, you're probably thinking that NATO summits are just like Ferris wheels, imposing and impressive, but taking a long time to go around in a circle and end up where you started. This was certainly the view of the former Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who said, "I bear solemn witness to the fact that NATO heads of state and government meet only to go through the tedious motions of reading speeches drafted by others with the principal objective of not rocking the boat." Well, he had a point. There is lots of ceremony and choreography involved when 28 world leaders gather together. Much of the real work has, of course, been done in advance. But I think this is a good thing. Do you really want to see a large group of leaders improvising and drafting the documents with far-reaching security and military policies? I don't think so. The funny thing about NATO is that people keep writing it off. One scholar, Wallace Tees, calls this the alliance crisis syndrome. NATO, since its birth, has always been proclaimed to be dysfunctional, irrelevant, misfocused, anachronistic, and dead. NATO died in Afghanistan. NATO as a military alliance is dead. This is what Charles Krauthammer wrote in the Washington Post in 2002. And organizations can indeed become irrelevant and wither and die. Or, much worse, they can become irrelevant but selfishly refuse to die. They instead linger on, wasting everybody's time and money, getting in the way of newer and better arrangements. But I don't think it's the case with NATO. Since Krauthammer wrote those words and said NATO's last rites, 9 countries have joined NATO, bringing the total membership to 28. So some people out there are still aspiring to be in the club. And NATO has taken on 13 new missions. I don't need to remind this audience the history of NATO, how US soldiers crossed the world to scale the cliffs of Pont du Hoc and fight and die to rescue Europe from its own tyranny, how George Marshall's $5 billion Europe recovery program prompted West Europeans to work together to rebuild their shattered continent. For US President Harry Truman, the Marshall Plan and NATO were 2 halves of the same walnut. In 1949, US officials pointed to Article 2 of the Washington Treaty to portray NATO as more than a classic military alliance, but a new form of security community. With NATO's robust security insurance policy in place, Western Europe got on with rebuilding the peace and prosperity without worrying incessantly about Soviet military ambitions. This generous but shrewd US strategic thinking set up the greatest motor of growth and progress in history. And it was a beacon of liberty for us in the enslaved East, who didn't have the benefit of joining then. Poland's joining NATO in 1999 at the summit in Washington was our coming home. Our shared transatlantic trading and security area now has 800 million people, accounting for half the world's GDP, a third of world trade, and more than 2 trillion in two-way investments. We can and should build on this achievement. The Transatlantic Economic Council looks to negotiate by 2014 a free trade agreement between Europe and America to boost growth and create jobs. And so far, I think it's clear, the utility of NATO, it's clear. Let's look at the not so clear and the not so easy, starting with Afghanistan. The NATO operation in Afghanistan, as has already been mentioned, has been NATO's longest, biggest, and costliest, both in manpower and treasure. At the last NATO summit in Lisbon, we agreed to complete the process of transition in Afghanistan by 2014. It makes sense to shift training into higher gear and to support Afghan security rather than to continue to pour far greater resources into our own military presence in that country. Just consider the current price tag, just for US operations, $10 billion per month in Afghanistan. Financing a 240,000 Afghan national security force could cost $4 billion per annum. I think it shows the cost-benefit analysis. And we are on schedule in scaling down operations in Afghanistan. The security situation in Afghanistan, despite everything you read in the media, is improving. More than 50% of Afghan people now live in provinces under the control of the Afghan National Security Forces. 2 years from now, the withdrawal of operational components of our troops will conclude. A new focus on training and mentoring will have begun. It's, of course, a tough problem. A lot is at stake. We don't want to see Afghanistan slump back into oppression and chaos. That's why NATO has signed the declaration on enduring partnership and friendship with the Afghan government. Similar agreements have been concluded by the United States and the European Union. We've been helping to stimulate regional security cooperation to involve countries such as China, Russia, India, who have a much bigger stake in the stability of Afghanistan than we do, because we want to see that Afghanistan succeeds and certainly does not become a security black hole the way it was in the 1990s. Let's be honest, Afghanistan exemplifies a profound problem for NATO and for all countries looking seriously at global defense problems. Now, almost overnight, in historical terms, things look different. Threats and hostile weapons are small, elusive, and they may be virtually invisible. Why should an enemy of this country strive to blow up, say, a military base here in Illinois, when remote hacking can disrupt that base's operations or create a huge breakdown in nearby civilian infrastructure to immobilize and to do so more effectively than a military strike would do? But, thank God, this works both ways. Why send heavy NATO forces into remote areas of Afghanistan to fight terrorists and extremists that plot against us, when remote control military drones can do a precise, ruthless job attacking them from a clear sky. Here in Chicago, back in 1999, British Prime Minister Tony Blair put it starkly. The most pressing problem of foreign policy we face today is to identify the circumstances in which we should get actively involved in other people's conflicts. We're not really closer to answering that question on the level of principle, because every case is different. Libya? Yes. Syria? No. What exactly are we defending these days, and against whom? Our physical territory and our people? Of course. We, on the borders of NATO, in Poland and other countries of Central Europe, insist on this. But what of the vital global IT and other networks that make modern life possible in our territory? In an interconnected world, an attack on one nation's networks can be an attack on all. This is what your Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, said 2 years ago in the context of online censorship by China and some other states. Her words also apply to defense. If countries want the benefit of sharing those networks, don't they have to shoulder a fair part of the responsibility to protect them? And what if they don't, or can't, or won't defend them against attacks from within their own borders? Whether we like it or not, long-established doctrines of national and collective defense have to change to this new reality. New technology creates new possibilities for highly focused military action and completely new moral and legal questions. Precisely because modern weapons such as UAVs are so precise, some people assert that using them starts to look less like military action and more like selective assassination. Good. We should tilt the economy of the battlefield to our advantage. Operations such as Iraq and Afghanistan and even Libya are just too expensive. That debate is already joined. NATO leads the way in formulating the legal and moral questions and answering them. This must mean looking at defense differently and doing it differently. We have had the Prague capabilities commitments and the Norfolk agenda. Yet military rationalization has been halting. The financial crisis now compels a change of pace. This issue is high on the summit, on the agenda of this summit. The NATO Secretary General urges us to move towards smart defense, above all in procurement. Bigger bangs, or maybe smaller but highly focused bangs for scarcer bucks. Improved planning, setting acquisition priorities, coordinating efforts better. European NATO members heard loud and clear the US Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, last year when he gave us a stern warning to pull our weight lest American leaders tire of underwriting Europe's security. The European Union is looking at a new pooling and sharing approach to generating capabilities. Some countries find it hard to accept. What about sovereignty? The answer to that is that you have only what you are able and can pay for. When times are hard, it makes sense to share. For most countries, in defense terms, this means strengthening niche specializations or investing in military systems where they enjoy a comparative advantage. Through other NATO initiatives, such as the ballistic missile defense or the alliance ground surveillance systems, we are demonstrating resolve to do things better. And I expect the summit to make important announcements in these two areas. NATO institutional infrastructure also needs to be streamlined, and it's happening. We are reducing the number of commands from 11 to 6, and consolidating NATO agencies from 14 down to 3. This makes important savings in manpower, which is, of course, fine as far as it goes. But is it not a bit parochial? Americans see decades of peace in Europe. You are asking yourselves why the United States should not look away and perhaps move away from European security and focus instead on the growing economic and military challenges that arise in Asia. Just before his untimely death last year, an American scholar, a very good friend of ours, a former Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs at the State Department, Ronald Asmus, gave a warning. We are all focused on problems beyond Europe: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, the Middle East. But I think you're starting to see the first cracks and fissures in the foundations of European security and stability, end quote. And I think Ron understood the big picture. His family had come to the United States from Germany after World War II. He feared a weakening of the rules of the game in European security. The EU and NATO pulling back from further enlargement as wider geopolitical competition crowded out long-standing cooperative security. You might think that he was right, given the continuing problems in the Eurozone. This is therefore my key point today. United States investment in European security continues to make sense. Retreating from transatlantic economic integration, supported by close military cooperation in NATO, would risk undoing the civilizational gains that have been achieved together by working since World War II. Europe still has more than its fair share of unfinished security business that arises from the Cold War. For example, last week my Norwegian colleague, the Foreign Minister, Jonas Støre, and I wrote a joint letter to the New York Times. We pointed out that 2 decades after the Cold War ended, thousands of tactical nuclear weapons remain in Europe outside of any control regimes, without any credible system of even accounting for these weapons. Separately, disagreements continue over conventional force levels in Europe. Above all, Russia's suspension of compliance in the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. These developments remind us that much of Europe, primarily us, the countries that emerged from the former Soviet bloc, still does not enjoy the security that Western Europe takes for granted. The open door policy of the alliance is not anymore at the fore of NATO discussion. But let's not give any impression that we have forgotten our agreement from the Bucharest summit to help Ukraine and Georgia move towards NATO membership. In all this, NATO's core Article 5 capabilities need to stay sharp. We need to see that they are still at the core of the alliance to feel more secure, because only then will we be persuaded to take part in expeditionary activities. For us to be persuaded, we need a robust exercises policy. Exercises with troops, not just staffs with maps. Stronger contingency planning. And I have to thank here President Obama, who decided that we should have contingency plans after 10 years of our NATO membership. But it took 10 years to even write plans to defend our part of Europe. And of course, we need more pooling of allied intelligence. This is the heart of the Connected Forces initiative, buttressing interoperability and complementing smart defense. We also need to show discipline in not selling advanced military systems to countries that do not regard NATO as a friend. And I think you know which country I have in mind. In many policy areas, the key to keeping European security in good shape means engaging creatively but honestly with Russia. Issues around missile defense and the possibility of other former Soviet republics joining NATO have been rumbling on for a long time now. Protection against ballistic missiles is part of our collective defense and cannot be outsourced to a third party. There are, of course, positive developments in our relations with Russia. Russia has provided invaluable logistical support for ISAF. Quite frankly, I don't know where we would be given the problems in transiting to Afghanistan via Pakistan. I don't know where we would be without Russia's help. So there are many good things that are happening. For example, last year, for the first time, a Russian submarine participated in a NATO exercise. Russia has participated in a joint counterterrorism exercise, Vigilante Skies, involving fighter aircraft. This year, we held a pioneering theater missile defense exercise, exemplifying our willingness to work with Russia on missile defense. It is worth pursuing constructive ideas, such as, for example, setting up a joint data center so that we may know what each side is doing on missile defense. But the Lisbon Declaration does not mean laying the groundwork for a joint NATO-Russia system. Russia can swiftly deploy and has deployed modern anti-aircraft S-400 missiles and is threatening to deploy offensive Iskander missile systems right on the very borders of the alliance. Of course, having military capacity does not mean a readiness to use it. Yet, every 2 months or so, Russian generals publicly announce plans for new military deployments on the borders of Europe, which is not exactly helpful. Poland wants NATO to work closely with Russia on how to revive a comprehensive arms control regime in Europe, fostering transparency, openness, and predictability. The NATO-Russia Council should engage not only on the easy, nice issues, but in particular on the issues on which we disagree. To sum up, the NATO family represents the world's foremost force for stability, pluralism, and creative democratic energy. 20 years after the fall of the evil empire, rival models are again available. Countries that draw on Western innovation to deliver economic success do it without much, if any, democracy. Therefore, a new form of global ideological competition is unfolding. NATO gives the world a unique political example and sets a unique moral example of development with democracy. Poland's own recent history shows how NATO membership has helped remove the legacy of communist structures and instincts from any serious role in public life. The contrast with the dismal situation in some of our neighbor states, for example in Belarus and some other parts of the former Soviet Union, is striking and depressing. At this time of a new ideological competition and new economic uncertainty, the need for democracies to stand firm and to stand together on their core values and principles is not declining. It is increasing. And this, I believe, should be the main message of the Chicago summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'd now like to open it up to a question and answer session with the audience. If you could please know that in the interest of time, we'd like you just to ask a question and to refrain from making comments. Yes, right over here. David Zimbarov, please. Please wait for the mic. It's coming.
Could you comment on why Libya yes and Syria no?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Could you comment upon why Libya was yes and Syria is no? In other words,
Because Syria is too difficult.
Oh, okay. Well, next question. Right there, please, the woman, Catherine, right behind you.
Dzień dobry and welcome. My question is in regards, what do you think about the Smolensk strategy?
Well, this is a reference to the tragic plane crash that we had in Poland. And of course, this was a huge trauma for the Polish people. We lost our president and 95 other people. I lost my deputy. I lost the head of the protocol department of the ministry. We lost the chief of staff and the chiefs of all the armed services. A huge national trauma. The plane went too low in fog, and we had a tragic accident. It's been thoroughly investigated. If you're interested in details, the English language government report about what happened is on the web page of the Prime Minister's office in Warsaw, available online.
Thank you. Yeah, right here, please. Thank you.
You mentioned that some NATO partners could add a lot of value by focusing on niche capabilities. Can you give a few examples of what that might be or look like?
Well, let me give you an example. In Poland, we've been reforming our defense system. Our government finally abolished the draft, and we now have 100,000 men, purely professional army. But actually the most controversial changes that we've made are in the Navy. We have cancelled plans to spend a lot of money to upgrade 2 frigates and a plan to build a corvette. And instead we are developing a purely Baltic-sized navy as a recognition that Poland can't do everything, that we are not and never will be a major naval power. You have the 16, or whatever it is right now, aircraft carriers. A couple of countries have aircraft carriers in Europe, and we cannot compete with that. This year, for the first time, 48 F-16s that we have purchased from the United States are fully operational. They are exercising right now in Alaska. So that if we want to help in an expeditionary operation, we have something to deploy, the most modern F-16s in Europe. But as far as the naval powers is concerned, we have gone to a more defensive posture. We've set up an ultra-modern, actually, anti-ship land system so that nobody will be able to land troops on the Polish coast. And as you may imagine, the Navy is not happy to have to operate a land-based system. But in the overall Polish defense strategy, I think it makes sense. And so it is for others. So, I imagine the British will want to contribute the Navy gaps because they are traditionally good at that. We have contributed, and we think it's our area of excellence, our special forces, for example, and so on. So that because Europe spends between 1/3 and half of what the United States spends on defense. The combined, if we were a country, European Union, we would be spending on defense more than China, India, and Russia put together. So we should be a military superpower. And the reason we are not is because there's so much duplication.
Thank you. Yeah, right up here, please, with the red tie.
Thank you for coming. My question regards the missile defense shield, or the proposed missile defense shield. There seems to be a degree of antipathy on the part of the Russians toward the concept of a missile defense shield. And I'm just curious, what do you think could be done to get them to see it our way and to allow us to establish a missile defense shield to defend against Iranian aggression or other aggression? Thank you.
Well, the Russian position seems to be evolving. They now, first of all, they would like to do a joint system, but we are not keen to do that because, as I mentioned, we can't allow NATO countries to be defended by someone else. NATO has to defend its members, and I hope the Russians will appreciate that. But in their recent, more technical assessments, they now seem to see that the NATO system, including the American part, including the part that is going to be developed in Romania and Poland, does not affect them this decade. Up to stage 3, and we've barely reached stage 1, it doesn't affect them. And stage 4, if it ever happens, will happen in the next decade. And they also should notice that the US side has been very clear and honest with us, saying that the phase 4 will only be done as long as, if the Iranian threat materializes, because at the moment it's still hypothetical. So we have a decade to deal with the Iranian challenge, or to work out a system which reassures the Russians. If we could do it in a way that NATO is protected, Russia is reassured, and Iran ceases to be a threat, everybody would gain.
Thanks. Yeah, right up here in the third row, please, Azim.
Thank you very much, Minister. Minister, your country was described by the New York Times as the last healthy economy in Europe. And one of the reasons articulated was because you were outside the single currency. And I'm just wondering, as an integral member of the European Union, but outside the single currency, what do you see the solution of this problem that doesn't seem to be going away? And secondly, what are the implications of the election of Hollande and France to the current Eurozone strategy?
Well, I think it's too simple to ascribe Poland's success to non-membership in the Eurozone. You're right that we are economically doing extremely well. The cumulative growth of the Polish economy, including what's projected for this year, over the last 4 years, is 18%. The average for the EU as a whole is 0. But the second fastest, cumulatively, at 8%, is Slovakia. And Slovakia is in the Eurozone. It helped cushion the crisis in 2009 a little bit. But the sources of our growth are much broader than this. First of all, the health of our financial institutions. Unlike in some countries, not a single Polish financial institution was so much affected, let alone in trouble during the financial crisis. So our banking supervision has worked. Second, we have had operating something that people are now only talking about for the last 14 years. We have a constitutional bar limit on indebtedness. We may not go beyond 60%, and at 55%, a break applies, whereby the next budget has to be balanced. And we are below 55%. We are one of the least indebted countries in Europe. the interest that you now pay on bonds is the real tangible credibility of a country. We now pay less than Italy, less than Spain. Last year, insurance on our 10-year bonds became cheaper than France's. So I think this is a result of 20 years of Polish people, building a healthy economy, rather than just not being in the Eurozone. On the contrary, remember, people are still joining the Eurozone. Estonia has joined since the crisis, and Latvia wants to join. And also, remember that some countries are reforming themselves effectively without rioting and succeeding. Latvia in 2009 had a drop of GDP of 20%. And they've reformed themselves, they are growing again, and their government got re-elected. It can be done. And I think our major advantage will be that we have not wasted the cohesion funds that we've received from the European Union. Right now, Poland is the biggest building site in Europe. It's not just the 4 huge stadia that we've built for the Euro Championship, but also about 1,400 kilometers of modern highways that will contribute to GDP growth as well. Also, we've improved our relations with Germany and Russia, which has helped. Our trade with Russia has grown exponentially. And Germany's trade with Poland is bigger than Germany's trade with Russia. Most Germans don't know that. So it's a whole mix of issues. Poland was a basket case in 1989. Poland was literally bankrupt. We were not servicing our debts. So we bit the bullet, we did what was necessary, and now we're reaping the benefits, which is, I think, good example to follow for our Greek friends.
And about the French election?
And the French election, I think, could be helpful because President Hollande obviously says something which is sort of obvious, but still needs a political push, namely that austerity and by austerity I don't mean being mean to people, I mean recovering competitiveness is the basis, and then you also need pro-growth policies. Now, it's key what you mean by pro-growth, of course. Traditionally, it's meant, in this country as well, Keynesian stimulation. But I hope here in Chicago you've noticed that the fiscal pact of the European Union, which allows the maximum budget deficit, structural budget deficit, to be 0.5%, has meant that the Chicago School has won over Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics have been outlawed. So by stimulating growth, we now have to mean finding new markets, and there's plenty to do. We still need free trade agreements with plenty of fast-growing areas of the world. We also need to complete our own single market. Inside Europe, something like 40% of online transactions fail because of cross-country legal issues, which is absurd, and we have to deal with that. And there are other issues that will increase labor mobility and will further integrate the European market, and that's the way to grow.
I know we have some students in the audience. Are there any questions from students that we have here? Well, okay, not a student, but...
Dzień dobry, and dziękuję for recalling Ronald Reagan's words at the end of your talk. At the beginning of our administration, our country canceled the installations in your country and in Czechoslovakia in exchange for a reset with the Russians. In your view, what has the reset gained for NATO?
Well, I've mentioned already that thanks to Russia opening up the northern logistical route, we've been able to supply our forces in Afghanistan. That's not a small thing. There is still, unfortunately, anti-NATO rhetoric in Russia by Russian leaders towards their own society, which is unfortunate. But in practice, as I've mentioned, stuff is happening. We have, in addition, a cooperative airspace initiative, and other good things are happening. We were not too upset about the reconfiguring the US base in Poland. We think this new configuration, if it happens, will be able to tackle a broader range of missile threats to Europe. So if it happens, it will be a better installation than what was proposed. Whether announcing the decision to do it on the 70th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland was a good thing, that's another matter.
Yeah, a question. How about right over here? Yeah.
Hi, I'm curious, to what degree can we consider education to maybe be the preemptive strike that NATO could look for as a creative solution in the future if we provide education and economic opportunity to people that may have become militants in the future against NATO? To what degree did that sort of theme come up in NATO discussions?
Well, we are a military alliance, not the Salvation Army. You can only do education when the state authorities of a country want it to happen. It's very difficult to go over the heads of a country that does anti-NATO propaganda. We do have a network of NATO information centers in Moscow, in Kiev, in many places. So some work is being done. But, you know, there is so much freedom of information now that the people who want to know about what NATO is doing can get that information pretty easily.
The lady in the hat, please. Please wait for the mic.
I have actually two questions. One question is, last Friday I called one of the major investment houses in United States, Morgan Stanley, and actually I insisted whether there is some investment to be made in Poland, which I wanted on a small scale to do myself. And the high-ranking Morgan Stanley consultant talked me to absolutely not doing that. So when I still debated him, just like what you said, Minister, he said, but did you consider this incredible inflation? And so that's one question. The second question, just a friend of mine you can see it on YouTube, and actually Mr. Lukashenko said that he could take Poland in 8 hours. This is just on how strong defense system is. That's two questions.
Thank you very much.
Well, if you want investment guide, it's very simple. You could follow, and it's because I'm a politician, it's all online. You could follow how I invest and do the exact opposite. And as regards Mr. Lukashenko, I'm unfamiliar with the statement that you're making, but I could just repeat what Mr. Bush said in a different context. Bring him on.
Okay. Yeah, right back there, please, with the blue shirt.
Minister, thank you. The one country I did not hear you mention today was Pakistan. You referred to them in terms of the aerial strikes from unmanned drones, but do you feel that NATO's approach to dealing with Pakistan is adequate at the moment? And if not, how would you recommend changing it?
Well, thank you for that one. It's really easy. There's a saying that if you're not confused by the relations between Pakistan and the West, you don't understand anything. And you know how difficult it is. There are parts of the Pakistani government that want the right thing, and there are others that really don't. And it's a real conundrum. I was personally hopeful that once you've located and dealt with extreme prejudice with Mr. bin Laden, that would be the last straw, the last motive for the forces of light in Pakistan to deal with the radicals in their own midst, and that Pakistan would sort itself out. Instead, as you know, some of the people who helped us to track down bin Laden have been targeted. So it's extremely difficult. But I understand that the president of Pakistan is coming to the summit, and I understand that the transit route through Pakistan is being opened, which is excellent, which would be excellent news, because remember that drawing down from Afghanistan is a huge logistical operation after 10 years. We have a vast amounts of equipment to move, and it's most economic to do it by sea, and the closest access to the sea is the Pakistani port of Karachi. So for the sake of Pakistan, I hope that the forces that wanted to become a democracy and to hold extremism in check, that those forces prevail in that country. But it takes a lot of optimism to think so.
Yeah, a question right here from the Vade, please. No, right there, in the third row.
My question is further about Pakistan. What do you see in the future of drones and precise weapon use in the country, and it's possible reducing in scope or expansion in scope as we go forward, and territory that it covers? Especially when a democratic country's parliament has unanimously said, don't strike us.
Well, I think the problem with drones is when they hit the wrong people. I mean, when they hit terrorists, then it's legitimate self-defense. I mean, if it's people who are actively plotting to kill us, we have the right to defend ourselves. So, as in the entire war on terror, the real issue is intelligence, and is finding and identifying the targets. And mistakes are inevitably made, I'm afraid.
Okay, next question. Yeah, right up here, please, in the third row.
With all the issues happening in the Eurozone and like with the countries that are actually deciding to leave the Eurozone, do you think they could take a negative toll on the participation and cohesiveness of NATO? In addition, you mentioned Eastern European countries wanting to enter. So I was wondering, like, what possible benefits could they have in entering? Because in my econ classes, from an American perspective, a lot of people talk about the Eurozone as crumbling and having a lot of faults.
Thank you.
Well, what are the benefits of a vast, rich, single currency area in Europe? Well, the same as here. The United States, in its infancy, did not have a single currency. States issued their own currency, and in fact, several US states in the first half of the 19th century went bankrupt. The Union became a real federation when you mutualized one, we have bankers here who know much more about this than I do, but I understand that the part of the deal, for example, over where your capital city should be, Washington, was a dispute about how to finance the debts from the War of Independence. And I understand that Virginia was more solvent, Massachusetts had a problem, and that's why Washington was fixed where it is. And mutualization of debt is usually the point of no return for a federation, for example, for Switzerland. And in Europe, we are at that point. Are we willing to mutualize? Because on the whole, Europe is the largest economy on earth, the richest, and our debt should be a very desirable bond to hold, and we are potentially a second reserve currency. And until 2009, the euro was becoming a rival to the dollar in that sphere. Greece is arguably a 50 billion euro problem in an 18 trillion euro economy. But we've mishandled it, and we've mishandled it. The problem, in my opinion, at core is not economic, but is an issue of governance. You have a single currency area, but you also have a single treasury and a single central bank. We have a single central bank, but it doesn't have enough powers, and we do not have a single treasury. That's why it is so difficult to deal with a relatively trivial problem. Now, why do countries want to join the euro? Well, look at what happened to Greece before trouble started. Greece had high debts, big deficits, not a very competitive economy, and at the same time was paying the German interest on its bonds. Great, if you can get it. So membership in the Eurozone gives you additional credibility because you ride on the credibility of the most powerful economies in it. And the trick is not to waste that and avoid reforms. Some countries, some countries in the Eurozone got a boost for a decade. We don't count on that effect anymore because our Eurozone bond interest rate is already below some Eurozone members' interest rates, as I mentioned already. But what we do count on, and this is still an attractiveness of joining, is that your transaction costs go down. So, when you're a relatively small currency like the zloty, when people make investments, they are worried that there is an exchange rate risk. You eliminate that. And because you have a stable relationship, your competitiveness in terms of the price of your assets and price of your labor is more visible to investors. I still think there is a case, an economic case for joining, and Poland has announced that we will fulfill the most important criteria of joining, namely keeping the budget deficit below 3% of GDP in this parliament. It also strengthens your credibility. And then for us, of course, there's also a political argument. Europe is, in fact, there is the outside kind of boundary, if you like, of EU membership, but then within EU membership, you belong to successively closer clubs. To be really influential in Europe, you have to belong to all of them. So not just the Schengen freedom of movement, not just others, but also the euro. The Eurozone will be the the inner core of the European Union, and Poland wants to be one of the leaders of Europe, and therefore, politically, we feel we need to belong.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for. Please join me in thanking the Minister for his comments.